They did not only hurt you, they broke the version of you that kept showing up again and again, kept forgiving, kept giving chances, kept believing in something better. Under all the chaos, there was still something real that you were trying to protect. And here's the part most people never say clearly. When a narcissist finally goes too far with someone who gave them real care, something shifts in a deeper way. Not always visible at first, but it happens in the background of their mind. And once it begins, it does not fully go back to how it was. What looks like their victory is often the start of something unstable inside them. And what feels like your lowest point can become the first moment you actually start seeing the truth without distortion. Before going further, take a small pause and ask yourself something honest. What did I keep accepting just to avoid conflict? What did I ignore just so things would stay calm? Sit with that for a moment, because your answer says more about the relationship than any explanation they ever gave you. Stay here this thought, because by the end of this, you may understand that the damage was never truly about your value. It was about what your love reflected back to them. And once that becomes clear, the emotional grip slowly starts to loosen. Not instantly, but enough to change how you see everything. When a narcissist begins to devalue someone who has been steady, loyal, patient, and emotionally present, it rarely happens without a pattern. At first, there is warmth, attention, and a strong emotional pull that feels special and meaningful. Everything feels alive and intense. But over time, something changes. The warmth fades. The closeness becomes weaker. What once felt safe begins to feel distant, then critical, and eventually quietly hurtful. The confusing part is that you may not have changed your behavior. You are still caring, still trying, still understanding, but suddenly your consistency does not feel appreciated anymore. It starts to feel like a problem to them. This happens because your stability quietly reminds them that they rely on you more than they want to admit. And dependence makes them feel emotionally exposed. So instead of valuing what you bring, they begin to reduce it in their mind. Your efforts become normal, expected, or never enough. They slowly rewrite the story in their own way. In that version, you become too emotional, too sensitive, too demanding, too heavy, even when you are simply asking for honesty or basic respect. Pay attention to this shift, because this is where confusion begins. They continue benefiting from your presence while slowly disconnecting emotionally. They still receive your care, but they stop protecting your feelings. That imbalance is not random. It quietly gives them control while making you work harder for less connection. And over time, you begin to question yourself more than you question the pattern. This is where emotional damage becomes deeper than people usually understand. It is not only pain. It is a split in your perception of reality. The same person who once felt like comfort now becomes the source of anxiety and confusion. Your mind struggles to hold both truths together because it wants things to make sense. So, at first, you try to explain it in softer ways. Maybe they are stressed. Maybe they are tired. Maybe something is going on. Maybe if I love better, stay calmer, try harder, things will return to how they were. This is how the cycle stays alive. You protect the image of who they used to be because accepting who they are becoming feels too painful. But even while your mind hopes, your body already reacts. You feel it in your chest, in your overthinking, in the way peace no longer stays for long. Nothing fully settles anymore. And what makes it more damaging is how personal it starts to feel. They often use what they learned about you when you trusted them. Your fears, your soft points, your insecurities, the things you shared when you felt safe. Those same places start getting touched again, but now in painful ways. Even if they never openly admit intention, the accuracy of where it hurts makes it feel targeted. And repeated exposure to that kind of emotional pressure changes your nervous system. You start watching your words, reading their tone, adjusting your behavior, shrinking your needs. Not because you are weak, but because your system is trying to prevent more pain. Then mental exhaustion begins to build. This is where confusion becomes internal. You start holding two opposite ideas at the same time. One part of you remembers the caring version of them. The other part is dealing with the cold or hurtful version. The mind does not like this contradiction, so it tries to solve it, but the painful solution often becomes self-blame. Instead of saying, "This is hurting me," you start thinking, "Maybe I am the problem. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I should adjust more." This creates a false sense of control in something that is actually unstable. And this is where the cycle deepens, because sometimes after hurting you, they may suddenly become warm again. A kind word, a soft moment, a return of the old energy you once knew, just enough to make you question your pain, just enough to keep hope alive, and then again, the distance returns. Then criticism, then silence, then normal behavior. This back and forth keeps your mind stuck in constant adjustment, always trying to predict which version you will get next. Over time, this weakens your trust in yourself. You stop relying on your inner sense of clarity and start looking outward for answers, often from the same person who created the confusion. That is why leaving or detaching feels so difficult even when the situation is clearly hurting you. After they hurt you, there is sometimes a noticeable change in their energy. They may seem calm, even detached, sometimes almost unaffected. While you feel pain, they may appear composed. This contrast can feel disturbing, but what is happening there is not real emotional strength. It is often a short psychological reaction tied to control. In that moment, causing emotional impact can give them a temporary sense of power. It creates a feeling of being in control of the emotional space between you. Your reaction becomes proof to them that they still have influence, that they can affect your state and remain untouched themselves. But this is not stable. It fades quickly, and because it fades, the pattern repeats. The emotional push, the reaction, the temporary control, then emptiness again. What they often do not see is the long-term effect of losing someone who gave them steady, emotional support. At first, they may act as if replacing you is easy. New attention, new people, new validation may seem exciting, but novelty does not provide stability. It does not provide depth or emotional grounding. What you gave was consistency, memory, emotional presence, patience, and familiarity. That kind of bond builds over time and cannot be replaced quickly. So, after the initial rush of something new fades, instability starts to appear. The new environment may not feel as emotionally steady. There is a tension but not the same grounding. There is excitement but not the same safety. This creates restlessness, more searching, more dissatisfaction, more shifting from one source of attention to another without real satisfaction. Because what is missing is not attention but emotional steadiness. Even if they do not recognize it, that absence affects them over time in quiet ways. Meanwhile, something very different begins in you. At first, it is not strength, it is exhaustion. A deep emotional fatigue that makes pretending impossible. The effort to hold everything together starts breaking down. And what once felt like love begins to feel like emotional depletion. This moment is painful because awareness does not always feel empowering. Eering at first, sometimes it feels like grief, like slowly realizing that the story you were holding on to was not what you thought it was. You begin to notice patterns more clearly, the moments you excused, the times you ignored your own discomfort, the ways you kept adjusting yourself just to maintain connection. And this awareness also turns inward. You begin to see your own participation in staying, in hoping, in overgiving, not as blame but as clarity. And that clarity changes how you understand everything that happened. Still, this is where something important begins to form quietly underneath all the pain. Where something important slowly returns back to you. Your own inner signals that you had pushed aside for a long time. The instincts you once ignored begin to make sense again. That uncomfortable feeling you kept explaining away starts to look less like weakness and more like information. The limits you struggled to keep start to feel necessary instead of selfish. This ship, it's big, even when it happens quietly and slowly over time. Because when your attention starts turning back toward yourself, instead of constantly chasing someone else's approval, something inside the bond begins to loosen. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but in a real and noticeable way. And if you have ever wondered why clarity often feels painful before it brings relief, this is the reason. You are not simply losing a person in your life. You are releasing a hope that was never fully aligned with your well-being, a hope that kept asking you to go against yourself. As this clarity grows, something else begins to happen that most people are not prepared for. The constant access they had to your emotions starts to fade. Your availability is not the same anymore. The way you respond changes. The openness they once relied on begins to shift. And when they feel that shift, a very familiar pattern often appears. They return, but not usually in a direct, clear, or fully responsible way. Most of the time it is subtle. A casual message sent as if nothing happened. A reaction to something you posted. A small check-in that seems harmless. A memory brought up out of nowhere. A soft apology that lacks real depth. On the surface, these things look simple, even innocent. But underneath, they often carry a quiet test. They are trying to see if they still have access to your emotional space, if the door is still slightly open. This is why these returns can feel so confusing, because sometimes they do seem calmer, softer, even more thoughtful. They might speak in a way that feels different from before. They may say just enough to wake up old emotions in you. Just enough to make you wonder again. Maybe they understand now. Maybe things have changed. Maybe this time is different. That kind of thinking can come back very quickly when hope gets triggered. But this is where you need to be careful. A softer tone is not the same thing as real change, emotional access without real account. Tidability is often just the same pattern wearing a different appearance. And if the connection opens again without strong and clear boundaries, the cycle usually starts again in the same order. First, closeness returns. Then, control starts to appear again. Then, confusion builds. Then, emotional withdrawal happens. Then, pain follows. And sometimes it moves even faster than before. The second time can feel worse because now you are not only dealing with what already happened, but also with the disappointment of believing that the return meant something new. That added emotional weight can make everything feel heavier than before. If this part resonates with you, then what comes next explains something deeper that is often missed. There are also consequences on their side, even when it does not look obvious from the outside. The deeper effect is not always visible immediately. It is rarely a sudden breakdown or a dramatic outcome. It is much quieter. It shows up slowly in what weaken. Underneath the image they show to others. When someone repeatedly hurts or discards a person who genuinely cared, supported, and stayed consistent, they lose something important over time. They lose access to a type of connection that is not based only on attention, performance, or short-term gain. They lose a stable and honest reflection of themselves through another person. Even if they never consciously think about it, this absence still affects them in subtle ways. Over time, their connections can become more shallow, more unstable, and more focused on quick validation instead of depth. The same pattern tends to repeat again and again. Gain attention, enjoy it briefly, lose interest, devalue, disconnect, and then repeat the cycle. With each repetition, something inside becomes less steady. It becomes harder to feel lasting emotional satisfaction. There is also a kind of inner fragmentation that develops. Without real and grounding bonds, their sense of self depends more and more on outside reactions, attention, approval, control, status, or influence. But those things are unstable. They constantly change. So, the sense of self that depends on them also becomes unstable. From the outside, it may still look like confidence, but internally, it can feel like constant searching, like something that never settles, a kind of emotional hunger that keeps shifting shape, but never fully ends. And what looks like winning or moving on can actually become a slow inner weakening over time. The short-term protection they create often cuts them off from deeper emotional nourishment later. At the same time, what makes this difficult for you is that the relationship was not painful every single moment. There were real moments of closeness, real chemistry, real memories that felt meaningful and alive. It is important to admit that because healing becomes harder when you try to see everything in pure black and white. The issue is not that every moment was bad. The issue is that the good moments were mixed into a pattern that slowly trained you to accept inconsistency as normal. You began to measure love by intensity instead of stability, by relief after stress instead of consistent peace, by rare moments of warmth instead of steady care. And because of that, letting go or emotionally detaching can feel like withdrawal. One part of you remembers the highs, another part remembers the emotional lows, one part misses them, another part feels fear, one part wants answers, another part just wants quiet and rest. That kind of inner conflict is very normal after a bond like this. It does not mean you are weak. It means your nervous system adapted to a connection that mixed comfort and pain in unpredictable ways. So it takes time for your system to understand safety again. There will still be days when you miss them even while knowing they were not good for your emotional stability. There may still be moments when you wish for one more explanation, one more apology, or one sign that your effort mattered. But as you stay closer to your own reality instead of the emotional confusion, something slowly begins to change. You stop chasing validation from the same person who distorted your trust. You stop asking them to confirm the harm they were never willing to fully admit. And gradually your energy starts coming back to you. Not because everything suddenly feels easy, but because your attention begins to return to where it was always needed. That return to yourself is the real turning point. At first, it can feel small and subtle. You take longer before responding. You pause instead of reacting automatically. You start questioning old emotional habits instead of following them. You stop over-explaining your boundaries again and again.